In Chapter 4, Morley Glicken, our author looks at the profession of social work practice and really kind of gives us an idea of the different ways of practice and types of practice that social workers will find themselves in their career. He titles this particular chapter or subtitles it the sophisticated generalist, and I believe he means by this that of well, generalist sometimes can be confused with the term generic, and they're two very different things. Whereas generic refers to kind of a kind of a basic kind of a thing without anything fancy on it or whatever. A generalist is someone who or is a person who has skills and knowledge in many different areas. It's not somebody who's focused on one area, but who has been trained in many different areas on a more with a more broad base of knowledge, let's say, than a specialist might have, and so is prepared to really work in a variety of different settings and to use the different skills that they've honed and developed in those different settings. The schools of social work that I've become familiar with over the years focus primarily in the BSW level upon a generalist approach in teaching their students. So they're prepared for a variety of different work settings and have the capacity to really put themselves into many different situations with clients. The difference with, as opposed to the generalist, is the social work specialist, which we'll be talking about a little bit later on in this lecture, and that's an individual who really focuses, has particular skills developed to a higher degree in a particular area. But generalist social work practice has among some of its tenets is one of the important things is focusing upon empowering clients to solve problems and build on strengths. We do not desire in a social profession to develop a typical doctor-patient relationship where we are the expert and our clients come to us for knowledge and skills and to be fixed. In the social work profession, our goal is to empower our clients no matter what type of job you have, no matter what type of setting you have, whether you're generalist or specialist. You want to empower your clients to be able to deal with their problems and their lives more effectively on their own and not really need us to be intervening with them. So we work together with clients to promote social and economic justice and to reduce those adverse conditions that impact them. In this particular setting for the generalist, your client could be an individual, could be a family, an organization, a group, a community, a neighborhood, anything like that. And you see here there's a whole variety of kinds of things that the generalist practice includes that would really, well, the phases of our generalist intervention generally is assessing the problem, planning how to resolve the problem, implementing your treatment plan, your case plan, or your intervention plan, however you want to say this, evaluating how it's done, if you've made progress or not, and if you've made progress, bringing about a successful termination, and then perhaps following up sometime later to see how the client's maintaining change. Assessment of information includes information gathering that might help us to understand why the client is currently having a problem. And one of the big areas here that's important, and I've mentioned this earlier, is that we need to be aware of our clients' medical problems or their biological health, so to speak, because oftentimes we can wind up treating a particular problem as a behavioral or emotional issue that has a purely biological basis. I believe it is in this chapter that the author uses thyroid problems as an example of this. Children and adults who have malfunctioning thyroids, either hyper or hypothyroidism, exhibit behaviors and experience emotions that look like psychological problems and look like behavioral problems. And if you treat it as such, you're never going to solve the problem. And if you, but a good thorough physical will determine this, and just some simple tweaks in medical interventions can resolve all of those issues. You're also going to assess in the assessment, the religious, how they fit into the religious picture, what their social situation is like, what their economic circumstances are, how their family is, et cetera, as well. Our practice as generalists and also as specialists for that matter in the social work field is guided by the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics that was established I guess, rewritten in 1996 and revised again in 2008. And this includes several ethical principles that include such things as service, social justice, the dignity and worth of individuals, human relationships, integrity, and practitioner competence. We will be addressing the Code of Ethics in another lecture a bit more thoroughly. Generalist practice, though, includes the use of social work knowledge and skills and values while respecting the unique characteristics and resources of our clients and many of their very diverse, at-risk, and multicultural groups. The nice thing about working in this particular field is that not only do we grow professionally as we work with more persons because we learn about those individuals and their groups and their origins and the particular issues that they may face, but it also helps us develop as individuals as we grow in our understanding of the world around us, because we get to meet and get to know people from walks of life that otherwise we might not encounter. In the course of our work, we have to look not only in a micro level of our client and the client's immediate environment, but also take a look at the macro picture, the bigger picture, and look for signs of oppression and discrimination like racism and sexism and ageism and those kinds of things, and really work to fight those things. Use your professional skills to challenge those particular things. Where we're going to find them usually is not so much, although we will see them sometimes on individual interactions, but on a larger level, a lot of times we're going to be looking at institutional oppression and discrimination, not individual discrimination so much. There is a strong emphasis in generalist practice upon developing and maintaining positive relationship with your clients, with your colleagues and providers in the community. When you challenge institutions, when you advocate for your clients with others, it's important that it be done in a way that respects the other individual, that shows some recognition perhaps of the importance of the institution. Because when you do advocate on behalf of your clients, when you do challenge institutions on behalf of your clients, you need to be heard. And if you assault other individuals, and if you mount an assault on an institution, you won't be heard. They'll be defending themselves against you. And so while being assertive, it's important to do so in a way that other people can hear you, and that means maintaining a positive relationship while you go about that. And certainly the communication is not only involved in speaking effectively, but also includes listening to others and be able to experience and display appropriate empathy and genuineness in your interactions with others. So the person and environment picture that we talked about last week, where it isn't just the client you work with, but you work with the client and the client's relationships with others and with institutions. We exist within groups and neighborhoods and communities and families, and so we must deal with all of those different elements in the client's life if we're going to effectively serve that client. Now, social work practice has two broad practice areas. One is direct practice with client, and this again is that micro field we've talked about in the past, where we are assigned to work with individuals who have social and emotional needs or particular kinds of issues and difficulties that we're there to try to help with. And the other broad practice area is community and organizational practice, and this can be micro practice as well. If you're working with say for instance, a particular group of youth, for instance, in your community or something like that, wouldn't necessarily be considered macro practice. It'd be micro practice. But sometimes community and organization practice also does involve macro practice, working in research and development and things like that as well. Research and policy development, I should say. Direct practice with clients involves a number of specialties, and this is just a very, very partial list of the kinds of areas where you may find yourself practicing: medical social work, clinical social work, industrial social work, school social work, and there are many, many other areas of fields where you may find yourself interacting with clients, and these are just a few ideas about that. It has been said in some basic social work texts that I've read, and I believe this is true, that generally everybody with a social work degree at one point or another is going to find themselves working with children. It just seems to be one of those things that everybody goes through. Not to say that it's an unpleasant thing, and in fact, many people are attracted to the field because they want to work with children. But whether that's your objective or not, you're going to find yourself oftentimes working with kids in this field. When you look at clinical social work, it talks a little bit about sometimes referred to as counseling and psychotherapy, that are other terms that are used to describe clinical social work practice. And I think we're talking about this here because we're going to focus a little bit more upon clinical social work for the remainder of these slides, although all of these slides can really be applied to any of these particular fields of practice, but the way the lecture develops, it seems to focus upon clinical social work, the clinical social work field. And so just deciphering here between counseling and psychotherapy, counseling usually refers to, the client presents with a particular kind of a problem, and this could be in a sort of a therapy relationship. It might be just in a, you're working for a community organization and the client comes to you, or you may encounter this in any kind of practice. And so the client needs help resolving a problem. You provide whatever, advice. I don't like necessarily seeing that term in here because it's probably not a good idea always. Sometimes you give your clients advice, and that's in times of crisis. But generally speaking, I think we try not to give advice to clients because the client needs to reach their own conclusion. It isn't what we think is best, it's what they think is best. But in any event, the word is here: advice, support, other kind of superficial techniques. This type of relationship and superficial implies cheap, and that's not necessarily what this means, but sort of band-aidy in a way. It's a short-term intervention, this counseling kind of thing, and life goes on and they move on, and that's it. Psychotherapy implies a longer term relationship where and again, this is not always the case, but this slide implies that it primarily focuses upon unconscious processes and underlying reasons for difficulties and things. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case in psychotherapy. That is certainly one area of psychotherapy, and it's one that is pretty important in the field of psychotherapy, is that the psychodynamic approaches we'll refer to later. But it doesn't always apply. It doesn't always address underlying issues. But here again, the issue is deeper issues. Let's say longer term relationship generally. There are 5 major theoretical approaches to helping people according to this particular text, and I think this is really pretty inclusive of the kinds of say practice models you might be using in social work practice. You see here the strengths-based perspective, evidence-based practice, psychodynamic approach, cognitive approaches, and solution-focused therapies. First, the strengths-based practice. This recognizes the fact that everyone, including our clients, have strengths despite the kinds of barriers and challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis. And focusing upon those strengths, finding those strengths, and identifying those strengths and focusing upon them rather than concentrating on the client's weaknesses and deficits is the thing that promotes the opportunity for growth. It really kind of turns the worker-client relationship into a very positive relationship, or very positive experience for the client. So the strengths of both the client and the environment can be leveraged to achieve client-centered goals. And there's a certain way we go about this, because when we understand that focusing upon what's wrong with an individual doesn't help that person get better. It's really what's focusing upon what's right about them, what they can do about the situation. And so really, in using the strengths-based perspective, you're going to take a look with the client at maybe what has happened in the past that might have been somewhat similar, sort of a corollary or parallel to the current situation, and what did the client do in those situations? How did the client overcome these problems, and help the client figure out what tools, what strengths they've used in order to move beyond and resolve those issues so that life could go on, and then help that client to identify the strengths and apply them to this current situation and look for ways of doing that in this particular situations. Because everybody has those experiences, those success experiences in their past. We have the ability to resolve our problems, and clients do as well, when there is somebody here to help us recognize that really the majority of our life has been successful, and that's the key. When we're kind of beaten down, or we're encountering an issue that we don't know what to deal with, and we begin to feel as though there's just no way out, and we're kind of helpless and hopeless. It really is something very powerful to have someone help you see that previously you've been successful in most of your life, and so there's no reason it can't be the case here as well. So this really does imply, when they talks about here getting to know the client's aspirations and hopes and things, this implies that you're going to spend time with your client and really get to know that individual as a person. Now, this doesn't mean you're becoming your client's friend. That's a different thing altogether. But you are getting to know your client well as a professional and as a supportive person in that client's life. We avoid the use of labels if at all possible. From an earlier lecture, we talked about diagnoses, and you'll be hearing more about this as the semester goes along with me. Psychiatric diagnoses and labels, they have a purpose, I suppose, in communication among professionals. The fact is that the longer you work in the field, the more tied you're going to be to making use of diagnoses at times. But because for payment purposes and insurance purposes and other kinds of things like that. But a big, strong caveat for you is, don't let that label tell you who the client is. You still need to get to know who the client is. Don't let that label filter the reality of the client from your own knowledge of that client. Set the label aside. Deal with the client as an individual, and as much as possible, because those labels imply a weakness, a pathology that sometimes is well, it's incorrect. Sometimes it's not very helpful, usually in treatment, and it can provide, actually, it might provide the client an excuse for not getting better, because we take on our negative labels and positive labels, and we begin to act to fulfill the roles those labels require of us. So if even if a negative label isn't true, after a while, if you hear it enough, you begin to believe it about yourself, and you begin to act it out. Likewise, as a worker, it's also possible to kind of use diagnoses and labels with clients as an excuse not to try to be creative with people. Because you just think it's going to be a waste of your time. And so I encourage you very strongly to don't rely very heavily on labels and diagnoses. So we want to look at our clients in a hopeful, optimistic way at all times, no matter how complex the problem. And try to stay in the positive as much as possible. Look for not only the strengths within the client, but then the strengths and the supports in the environment around that client as well, and tap into those support systems that the client has, and helping networks that client might have that can also assist that person in moving forward. Because again, that's something that we do in our lives when we can't resolve issues ourselves, or we can't achieve certain things by ourselves. We go to the people closest to us for help. Evidence-based practice is the second type of practice that we find in social work, and there are some different definitions of it here. I think while the first definition, referring to it as the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of the individuals, probably a succinct way of putting it. I'm not sure that really is very helpful, but what it says basically is that you are deliberately researching and gathering information, and then trying to identify the most effective means of intervening for your client, so that client can be helped most efficiently. Gambrell's definitions of EVP says it is self-directed learning, which requires us as professionals to access information, permits us to, first of all, take the knowledge and that we do have, and provide questions that we can answer, look for the best evidence to answer the questions that we need resolved, analyze that evidence for its research validity. And this is where your research class comes in very, very important, and because you have to be an intelligent consumer of information. When you're reading studies, when you're collecting information about intervention techniques and things, it's really important for you to understand that just because it's in writing and just because it's in front of you doesn't necessarily mean this is equally valid with all the other things that are in front of you as well. You need to be a good consumer, an intelligent consumer of all this information. Because sometimes you're the person that's out there selecting these things on behalf of your client. And then, of course, you're going to use your client in making, rather include your client in making decisions as well. As little as possible, do you make decisions on behalf of your clients? You make decisions with your clients. Timmermans and Angel also said that evidence-based clinical judgment has 5 important features that include research evidence, your clinical experience, using skill in reading the literature, again, so that you have enough knowledge to take that information in and understand it, but also to make judgments about the quality of the evidence that's in front of you. Again, that's where this research class and the importance of understanding those concepts comes into play. And then, of course, this tells you that depending upon what your job is, what level of influence you have in an organization and things, it's going to determine really how you apply the information and that kind of thing. But anyway, so evidence-based practice, again, really involves, kind of looking for the most effective technique, understanding the information that you're looking at when you try to assess the most effective technique, and then taking that and applying it in your client's situation. The social work profession sometimes is criticized for relying too much on our gut level feelings about things. And I will tell you at other points in this class, listening to your gut and following your intuition is very critical. But we can't rely upon our intuition, and we can't rely upon gut feelings all of the time when trying to identify approaches and interventions for clients. Sometimes we need to go back to the intellectual and to the empirical, evidence-based approach to helping our clients. The psychodynamic approach believes that all behavior is determined by forces that are often unknown to us. Before we can overcome emotional problems, all of these unconscious forces and beliefs and experiences have to be understood and explored and resolved. And there's, I think that's probably a good summation of psychodynamic theory or the psychodynamic approach. I am not sure that I believe that all of psychodynamic approaches involve uncovering unconscious things from the past, but a large portion of it is that. But I believe there are some other facets of psychodynamic theory and approaches that definition oversimplifies. But in any event, here's a good example of this given, with the adult who was molested as a child. Now, you often hear, for instance, that children, or rather people who abuse their children, were abused as children themselves. And that is very often the case. I think I would bet you that probably the majority of child abusers have been abused themselves, been exposed to abuse themselves. However, if you reverse that, is it true that most children who have been abused will go on to become abusers themselves? The answer to that, according to most studies, is no. One study I read some years ago said that in fact only about a third of persons who were abused as children and were never treated for any of that abuse went on to abuse children themselves. So even without treatment, the majority of children abused in whatever way they have been abused do not repeat that with their own children. However, that's these are different studies, but in this particular case, we're talking about an adult who was abused as a child, and so oftentimes, if an individual is molested as a child and that's not treated, we have to find a way that individual has to find a way to resolve that. And so one of the ways that is resolved is by repressing the memory, so that the memory is no longer available. Of course, it's still in that person's brain. It's still there, but access to it, however this happens neurologically, is blocked. And so the person truly, genuinely doesn't remember these things, and yet may still find themselves in situations where they're very familiar kinds of things, and oftentimes those children or those individuals really may find that their children are being molested. And they don't see those things happening because they've never really resolved their own issues about their own abuse, and so it's very difficult for them to be sensitive and open to the signs and symptoms, or to be helpful to their own children who may be going through the same thing. And so that memory is repressed, and the other things that can happen, maybe not their own children being molested again, but that their own ability to connect with other adults, or to be to be engaged in intimate, trusting relationships with another person, are impaired. Their ability to do that are impaired, and so in order to resolve those issues, this would be a psychodynamic kind of approach, is to go back and try to uncover these memories and to identify that back there. Now, there are critics who believe that the psychodynamic approach doesn't work because just knowing why something happened doesn't make the damage go away. But I don't think, again, I think this is kind of an oversimplification of psychodynamics. I don't think you just, like, psychodynamics' objective is just to go back and identify why something happened and then you quit. That you go on from there and you try to say, okay, now what, and how, where might this be affecting you, and you look at how it impacts your life, and you begin to look at new ways to approach your life and things like this. So I don't think it's just simply knowing why something happened, but still there is I think a valid argument that sometimes digging up the past, well, that's just a part of it, and I think there's more to this than digging up the past. Freudian theory has been an underpinning of social work education for decades and decades. Goodness knows that I certainly was exposed to Freudian theory and ego psychology and psychodynamics and all those kinds of things in my undergraduate education with social work, and even in my master's training. Although I think the field has begun to move away some from psychodynamics and into these other areas more. It's still a pretty dominant field, both in psychology and social work, as something that's very important to understand, I think. And I'm not saying it's invalid by any stretch of the imagination. Psychodynamic therapy focuses upon unconscious conflicts and understanding how defense mechanisms are used to deal with those conflicts. The therapist-client relationship is focused in psychodynamic therapy, and is sometimes very key in uncovering some of these repressed issues. You may have heard of the terms transference and countertransference. Transference is a phenomenon that goes on between a client and a therapist or a social worker. It doesn't have to be in a psychodynamic relationship. This can be in a day-to-day social work relationship where your client attributes qualities that they recognize in you to their mother or father or other significant person in their life who may no longer be accessible to them. And attributing those qualities to you may want to do things for you that they would want to do for that individual. And so they may be more open to change. It can be a very useful thing, transference, in the growth process with the client, as long as you're conscious of it and be careful with it, and you don't overuse it. But at the same time, it can also be a very negative thing, because if there's unresolved conflicts in that relationship, you may find resistance with your client that you can't explain otherwise, and it could be about transference. And so the worker counterpart to that is called countertransference, and where the same thing applies but in the opposite direction, so that you attribute qualities of your client that really belong to some other person in your life, your own son or your own mother and father or whatever, and you find yourself reacting in similarly irrational ways to your client. Very important for you to know as a worker. And this is one reason why a lot of people will tell you that, that really having a therapeutic relationship of your own is something that can be very, very good when you're in this field. It's certainly not required of anyone, but it can be very helpful to a person in being the best worker they can, because these issues come up a lot in our work with our clients. But in any event, back to psychodynamic therapy, helping clients develop an understanding of why they think or feel as they do is accomplished here by illuminating unconscious reasons for those behaviors. Cognitive theories, however, really look at very conscious behaviors. The cognitive approach believes that people think before they respond to situations and events. I'll refer you back to an individual, a psychologist, I believe he was, could have been a psychiatrist by the name of Albert Ellis, I think in the 1950s, as a young psychotherapist, was working in mental institutions and was found himself very frustrated with the fact that the patients were making no progress, that they were in these long-term relationships with the psychiatrists and really getting nowhere in understanding what was going on so that they could begin to function in a more healthy fashion. Maybe we're being medicated to deal with their feelings and things like that. And Ellis determined that it was important to help clients become more empowered and to understand how to change their problems, or how to change positively, let's say, in a more effective manner. And so he developed a technique of intervention called rational emotive therapy, or RET. You may have heard of it. You may have studied about it in other areas. And essentially, a rational emotive therapy, well, let's say something happens. That is A, the antecedent, the thing that comes before. Okay? There is a consequence to that thing happening. C, consequence. Okay? So something happens A, there's a consequence C. And in the way that we are raised to believe, all of us pretty much, is that this thing outside of us happened and therefore we experience it. Another thing occurred as a direct result of that other thing. Oftentimes that thing is within us. If somebody says something that is derogatory and we take offense to it because just because we do. And so we say, well, they said this and I got mad. Okay. Well, cognitive rational emotive therapy puts something between that A and that C. And what do you think it might be but a B? Beliefs or thoughts. That is, A, something happens. B, we have a belief about that event, or we have a thought about that event, and that belief leads to C, the consequence. So somebody says something derogatory. B, and I'm oversimplifying this, B, I think they're saying that about me, even though they're trying to say it in general. And then C, I have a negative feeling. I get angry. I get hurt. Okay, so basically, remember the B part here. The thinking comes in between. The cognitive approach helps people see that that it isn't what happens outside of them that causes them to feel a certain way. It is what they say to themselves about that thing that happened outside of them that causes them to feel a certain way. Now, the nice thing about this is that it empowers the client to change the way they react. It doesn't depend on what goes on outside of them. It depends upon what they think. That's essentially a very simplified approach to cognitive therapy. It helps people see what's irrational about the way they perceive a situation and teaches people to view life situations more logically and accurately. It isn't what happens to us in life that causes us to be unhappy. It's how we view those events. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which takes cognitive therapy really and applies it then to the things that we do, how we should act, is based on the concept that our thoughts rather than our circumstances cause our feelings and behaviors as well. This type of therapy is very time limited, very structured. The intent of this therapy is not to create a doctor-patient relationship that's long-lasting. It is to create a worker-client relationship that is short-term and that empowers the client to understand his or her own processes, his or her own thought processes, and how his or her own feelings developed, and then how to take command of those things himself or herself. So rather than being doctor-patient, one up, one down, this relationship is very collaborative, very, kind of even and equal, and very educational in nature. And oftentimes relies on homework because it refers back to a lot of things that clients are asked to, in between meetings with the worker, or the therapist, to track certain kinds of events and how they reacted to it, and identify what their feelings were about those events and try to see how that led to their feeling, those kinds of things. It's a very, I think, a very interesting way. And in fact, cognitive interventions, by the way, now I've read something recently that suggests this might not be the case, but we have been understanding for years at least that cognitive therapies are most effective in treating depression of any of the therapies that are out there. Essentially, with the idea being that if you're depressed, you're telling yourself things that make you feel that way. So solution-focused therapy is the last of the five types of practice that are identified in our list, and SFT applies elements of the strengths-based perspective, the evidence-based practice, and cognitive therapy, and really kind of rolls it all into one. So it's a model that really has evolved over the years and places a lot of emphasis on respect for clients and their competence and strengths, and the collaborative relationship with the client, between the worker and the client, is the key. Change is going to happen. Change is inevitable. Change is ongoing. It isn't something that just is achieved and then you're done. So this is kind of goal-directed or task-directed intervention, so that the client identifies something that they would like to have different in his or her life, and along with the client, you identify steps to that process. How the client can get there, what the client needs to do, maybe what you as a worker needs to do to help and to assist in that respect. And so the focus stays on the solutions to the problems, and achieving that goal. So learning about the origins of the problem in this model is really more about, it's really not all that important according to this model, like it is in psychodynamic theory. It doesn't matter why that problem developed or anything. It's more about, what do we do about this problem now? How do we resolve this issue? And I know this is not right. This slide says it's a model which holds that there is only one single correct or valid way to live one's life, and that's not correct. I need to fix that slide, but it is a model that holds that there is not only one single or valid way to live one's life. So leaving the fields or the types of practice and just looking at a few things about effective practice and how we assure our clients of effective practice, there's three different areas we're looking at here. The first is on the individual level, state licensure. Alaska is one of most states, I'd say now, that requires social workers to be licensed on both the bachelor's and master's level. In Alaska, you have the licensed Bachelor of Social Work, or licensed Baccalaureate Social Worker, I believe it is LBSW, and the MSW, which is the licensed Master Social Worker, and that would be for individuals that are working in fields of practice that are not clinically based. And then finally the LCSW, which is the licensed Clinical Social Worker. That's for social workers that works in areas and fields of practice where there are diagnoses being made, basically, and you're treating those diagnoses. Now, certainly the LCSW in many ways goes against that whole thought about avoiding the doctor-patient relationship, because the LCSW tends to be the more traditional kind of intervention, whether it's psychodynamic or cognitive or whatever, but you have a client coming to the worker and the worker is treating the problem with the client. But I will say that an LCSW therapist is not going to just stop with seeing the client. The LCSW therapist is going to want to get to know more about the environment and perhaps intervene with the client in those environments, the family, the schools, the community, whatever that might be. And so even if there's a clinical focus to the social work practice in an LCSW's existence, that doesn't mean the LCSW has to restrict himself or herself to that sort of doctor-patient relationship. Again, remember, collaboration is the key in these relationships, and using strengths-based cognitive therapies, solution-focused, all those things can happen in the context of clinical social work. So these licenses all involve accumulating a certain number of supervised hours after graduating. Usually, I think it's 2 years worth of full-time work. You take a written exam. In some cases, you have to take an oral exam. You don't do that in Alaska. And then if you get that license every 2 years, you have to produce evidence that you've engaged in continuing education through workshops and conferences and educational experiences and those kinds of things. The intent of this, of course, is to make sure that you're staying refreshed and up to date in your information. Now, licensure, first of all, it protects your field, because state law says you can't call yourself a social worker unless you're licensed, and in order to be licensed, you have to have an education, and you have to pass a test, and you have to have been supervised in the field, and so that demonstrates your competence. So that's good for your clients, because your client knows if you're licensed, you know something about what you're doing. And that's good. It tells your client you don't have a degree in forestry, you get a degree in social work, and you've been trained specifically to help them, and people with forestry degrees may be working right next to you in your agency of practice. That's the sad truth that the types of work we do, other areas of professional expertise have things to contribute to our work settings. And please don't get me wrong, I respect other degrees, but they're not social workers. So the licensing law says they can't call themselves social workers. Just like you can't call yourself a psychologist or a doctor if you're not trained as a psychologist or an MD. So it protects your clients because it tells them where you're trained. It also protects your profession and your title, and it elevates your profession as a social worker. You should be licensed if you're practicing. You're not required to get licensed, by the way, but if you're going to call yourself a social worker, you have to be licensed, even if you have the degree. Now, schools of social work also have to be accredited, and as this slide tells you, the process for getting accredited is very grueling and involves a number of different things, including, submitting the curriculum and meeting minimal standards, certain standards as terms of what is to be covered in the curriculum and how people are educated, and, as well as all those other kinds of things about who's doing the teaching and what facilities are around you and all of those kinds of things. The Council on Social Work Education is the national body that accredits schools of social work. And if you have a bachelor's or master's of social work degree from a CSWE accredited institution, any employer around the nation will know what it is that, if they know anything about social work education, will be able to feel confident that they're getting somebody who's had a quality education. So that's why your social work degrees are, I think, so valuable, because it's a known entity out there, unlike many other degrees of a similar ilk that are not social work. People know what they're getting when they hire a social worker. Finally, just a few words about supervision before we close out this lecture. Even if you're an LCSW, this, as far as the state is concerned, you are qualified to open up your own office, hang your shingle, and have a private practice without supervision. That means that the state law does not require you to have anybody supervising your work, and you have tested out and been trained and mentored enough that individuals believe, and the state licensing board believe, you're competent. Okay. However, most every independent practitioner that I know, and I think most any of them that are really pretty with it, are going to have supervision. They'll contract with other professionals to provide supervision, because one thing you don't want to do in this field is to work in isolation. You don't want to close yourself off so that you can't talk with other people about what's going on with your clients, other professionals. Now, of course, it has to stay within the office, because of confidentiality, but you have to be open and able to talk with your colleagues about what's going on with clients. If you don't feel you can do that, you have a problem in your job, and that needs to be addressed, because you drive yourself out of the field if you isolate yourself. Supervision is one way to make sure you don't isolate. You have a more experienced, generally at least usually more experienced worker who can provide mentoring, some direction in your casework, provide an opportunity for you to to talk about what's going on and to go over your processes with your clients and yourself as individuals, etc., etc. Now, your supervisor is going to write you evaluations and recommend you for promotions and salary increases, and review your work. Your supervisor, by the way, legally is responsible for your work, and so there's a legitimate reason for your supervisor to need to know what you're doing, and you need to be honest with your supervisor about that, because both of you are legally responsible for the work you do. And as a supervisor in my current position with Children's Services, I supervise a group of individuals who investigate child abuse complaints now, and I tell people it's the easiest job in my office, because I've got good people working for me who know what they're doing and who are very, competent and very committed to their work and very serious about it. But I have to be very careful who I hire. I have to be careful to get to know them enough to know that I can trust their work, because they're away from me 90% of the day, and those moment-to-moment decisions that they make, I don't know about. I just know about what they come back and tell me, maybe what I hear from the client. And so it can be kind of scary being a supervisor because you are responsible for the work of other people. So as difficult as it may be sometimes to be supervised and to be open and honest about the work you're doing, and it shouldn't be, because we all need to share with others about our work, other colleagues about our work. It is important that you make use of that relationship, that you be open and honest with your supervisor, that you listen to input and feedback from that person, because this person is going to be really helpful to you in your career in many, many different ways. So that ties up Mr. Glicken's thoughts about the social work profession, as well as my own elaboration on those topics. And so if you have any questions, please do contact me. Otherwise, we'll be talking again in the near future, I'm sure.